The contract was already signed by the time anyone realized it bore the wrong woman's name. Sable had been standing in the third row of the presentation hall when the Alpha King's steward made the error, not the grand dramatic kind of error that announced itself, but the quiet, administrative kind that only surfaces when someone checks a ledger against a name on a document and finds they do not match. She had been ranked last. She had known she would be ranked last. The other women presented that morning were daughters of high houses, trained in diplomacy and court precedent, their names submitted by lords who could afford the presentation fee and the silk gowns and the particular kind of composed expression that said, "I belong here without effort." Sable had none of that. She had been submitted by her uncle, who had borrowed the fee and said it was an investment. She had worn her best dress, which was blue wool and clean. She had stood in the third row and tried to look like someone who had expected to be there. The sealed contract box sat on the steward's table at the front of the hall. Iron, small, the Alpha King's crest stamped into the lock plate in the shape of a wolf with its tail curled inward. The box held one contract. The contract had one line for a name. The name on it was supposed to belong to Councillor Vayne's daughter, Izenthi, who stood in the first row with a composed expression she had been practicing for 6 years. The steward had the box open on his table, and the document inside, and the quill in his hand, when the Alpha King walked into the hall from the far door. The wolf arrived first. That was how it always happened. Sable would learn later. The wolf moved through the Alpha King's body like weather moving through a room, not replacing him, but preceding him, visible in the way his eyes changed, and the way the air pressure seemed to shift, and the way every ranked wolf in the hall went very still at once. King Corvath walked the length of the hall at a pace that was neither hurried nor ceremonial. He did not look at the first row. He looked at the third. His wolf looked at Sable. The steward, who was already halfway through writing the first letter of Izenthi's name, wrote the rest of a different name entirely. He did not understand why until he looked down. The document read, Sable Voss. He said nothing. He sealed the box. He handed it to her. She had not known what to do with it, so she had taken it with both hands and stood very still, while Izenthi's breathing, somewhere in the first row, became extremely controlled. That had been 3 days ago. Sable was still carrying the box. She had not opened it. She had been told she could not open it. Only the Alpha King could unlock it, which he had not yet done, and she did not know whether that meant the contract had taken effect, or was simply waiting, or was a mistake that would be corrected when someone with more authority than a steward reviewed it properly. She carried it in the crook of her left arm when she moved through the east wing corridors, where she had been installed in a room that was quieter than her uncle's house, and had a window and a small iron stove. She set it on the table beside her cot when she slept. In the mornings, it was the first thing she saw when she opened her eyes. The box smelled faintly of old iron and something beneath that she could not name. She had touched the lock once, and the lock had felt warm, the way metal feels in a room that has been lived in long enough to hold heat. She had taken her hand back and not tried again. The east wing had its own rhythms. She learned them quickly, because she had always learned quickly. This was not a virtue in the environments she had come from, where being quick meant being given more work and no additional recognition, but here it kept her from the kind of errors that attracted attention. She was good at not attracting attention. She had spent 23 years perfecting it. She found the kitchens on her second morning and learned which cook preferred silence at bread hour and which one talked to himself companionably and did not mind being talked back to. She found the library on her third morning and spent 2 hours with the index, not the books. The index told her more about what a library valued than the books did. She read the Civic Records Index on her fourth morning. She read the Court Procedure Records on her fifth. She was in the Library Index on the 6th morning when the Alpha King appeared. Not heard, the wrong word, because she did not hear him. She felt the wolf first, a shift in the air and a particular quality of silence moving toward her along the shelves, and then he was in the doorway. He was not in ceremonial dress. He was in the kind of clothing a man wore when he had come from a morning of administrative work. Grey wool, collar open, no crown, a document in his hand that he was no longer actually reading. He was looking at her. His eyes had the particular quality she had noticed in the presentation hall, darker at the outer ring, the wolf visible behind them like light behind a screen. He did not say anything for a moment. She did not perform deference. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor with the library index open across her knees, and there was nowhere convenient to perform deference from that position, and also something in her had decided, quietly and without announcement, that performing deference was unlikely to help either of them understand what had happened 3 days ago. "You're reading the index," he said. "Yes." "Not the books." "The index first," she said. "Then the books." He looked at the document in his hand, as if he had forgotten it was there, and set it face down on the nearest shelf. "How long have you been doing that?" "Reading indexes first, since I was 9. The library at my uncle's house had 400 volumes, and no organization system. The index was the only way to find anything." He was quiet again. She had the impression he was doing something with that information, not filing it away the way people filed away small social details, but actually considering it, weighing it. She had not expected that. "The contract," he said. "Yes. Do you know what it says?" "No. You have not opened the box." Something shifted in his expression, not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. Most women would have found a way to open it. Most women would have had more practice picking iron locks than I do. She paused. "Is it an error? The name?" He looked at her for a long time. The wolf behind his eyes was very still. "My steward believes so." "Do you?" The answer took longer than she expected. "No," he said, and he left. She sat for a moment after the sound of his footsteps faded. She looked down at the index. She had lost her page. She found it again and kept reading. Her hands were entirely steady. She noted this as information without deciding what it meant. Isnthie came to see her that afternoon. She was taller than Sable by half a head and had the kind of beauty that had been maintained with considerable effort and expense. Perfect posture, perfect hair, a green gown that probably cost more than her uncle's investment. She had 2 attendants who stood at the door of the East Wing room and did not come in. Isthie came in. She stood in the center of the small room and looked at Sable and at the iron box on the table with an expression that was entirely composed and entirely furious. "You understand," Isthie said, "that this is going to be corrected." "I don't know enough about court procedure to know whether it can be," Sable said honestly. "The box is sealed, and the Alpha King has not indicated any intention to unlock it. The Alpha King's intention is not the relevant consideration. There are petitions. There are procedural remedies for administrative errors." "I know. I read the Civic Records Index this morning." Isthie looked at her very carefully. "You are nobody," she said. It was not cruel in tone. It was simply factual, the way someone states the weather. "You have no house, no standing, no training. Whatever the steward wrote on that document, you are not what the Alpha King needs." "Probably not," Sable agreed. "I have said as much to myself several times." Isthie had expected, perhaps, more resistance or more collapse. She received neither, and this seemed to disconcert her more than either would have. She left without saying anything else. Her attendants closed the door behind her. Sable sat with the box in her lap for a long time after that. She turned it over in her hands. The lock was warm again. She thought about procedural remedies and civic records, and the particular quality of the Alpha King's expression when she had asked him if the name was an error. She thought about the word he had used. "No." She set the box back on the table and went to dinner. The archivist found her on the 6th day. He was very old, which was the first thing she noticed, and he moved carefully, which was the second. He had the specific deliberateness of someone who had spent long years around knowledge they considered precious, and had developed the habit of moving as though they might break something irreplaceable. He was waiting outside the library when she arrived in the morning, and he introduced himself as Warden Cassell, and he said, "You should sit down for this." She sat. He told her about the wolf. "Not all wolves chose," he explained. "The Alpha King's wolf was not simply a supernatural quality of his bloodline. It was a separate entity in some functional sense, one that had its own recognition patterns and its own judgments, and in the oldest records, when the bond was strongest, the wolf chose the Alpha King's companion before he did. Consciously, deliberately, in the way a wolf selects territory, not with drama, but with a certainty that was simply not negotiable." "How often does that happen?" she said. Warden Cassell looked at the window for a moment. The morning light was grey and northern, and fell across the old shelves in long bars. "The last time," he said carefully, "was 400 years ago, to the month." He let that settle. "The archivist before my predecessor documented it. A woman named Lithal. She recorded the date and the name of the woman the wolf chose, and the Alpha King's response, and then she sealed the record and placed it in the restricted shelf with a notation that said, 'For the next archivist who needs it.' And the woman the wolf chose became the last Alpha Queen. The bloodline has not produced another." He looked at Sable directly. "The wolf has not moved toward anyone since, not in 400 years, until 3 days ago, in that hall." She was quiet for a moment. The box was in her lap. "Tell me the rest," she said. He told her the rest. The wolf's choice, once made, was not reversible by administrative procedure. It was not a preference. It was not a ceremonial signal. In the oldest compact of the bloodline, the compact the court had mostly stopped teaching because it had not been relevant for 4 centuries, the wolf's recognition was the bond beginning. The contract the steward had written was not an error that had caused the wolf to choose. The wolf had chosen. The contract reflected what had already happened in the deepest architecture of the bloodline. Procedural remedies could petition the king. They could not petition the wolf. "So Councillor Vayne's petition," Sable said. "Was filed this morning," Warden Cassell said. "Yes." She sat with that. Through the library window she could see part of the courtyard below. 2 of the king's advisers were walking together, speaking in the close and careful way that meant they were deciding something. She had not imagined, when her uncle had submitted her name for the presentation, that she would ever be the thing being decided about. She had imagined being ranked last and going home, and her uncle being disappointed, and the world continuing, as it had always continued around her. "What does he want?" she said. "The king, actually." Warden Cassell considered this for a long time, as if the question deserved the consideration it was owed. "I think," he said, "that he wants someone willing to ask him that question directly. He has had very few people who were." She walked back to her room with the box and sat on the bed and looked at it. 400 years. She turned the number over in her mind the way she turned unfamiliar words. Carefully, from different angles, the last Alpha Queen. She thought about what that meant and what it did not mean, and what the difference between the two was. She thought about Izenthe in her green gown, entirely composed, entirely certain, and about the petition filed that morning, and about the Alpha King's expression when she had asked him a direct question, and he had answered it honestly. She thought about the fact that he had come back the next morning. He had not announced himself. She had been in the East Wing corridor at the hour before the council session, carrying a stack of civic records she had borrowed from the library, on the grounds that if a petition was being filed about her status, she should understand the process thoroughly. He had been walking in the opposite direction, and they had both stopped. "You are reading the petition records," he said. "If someone is petitioning about my status, I should understand what they can and cannot do." He looked at the stack in her arms. "Those are administrative documents. Most people in your position would be speaking to lawyers. I don't have a lawyer. I have the index." She adjusted the stack. "And Warden Cassell." Something shifted in his expression, the faintest recalibration, as if she had added a variable he had not accounted for. "Come to the council antechamber this afternoon," he said, "after the session." And he walked on. She had gone. The antechamber was a stone room off the main council hall, smaller than she expected, with a long table and candles, and a smell of old paper, and decisions made in low voices, over long hours. He was already there when she arrived, which meant he had waited, which was information she filed carefully. He stood at the end of the table. The wolf was visible behind his eyes, not agitated, but present, watching. "Sit," he said, and then appeared to reconsider the word. "Please." She sat. He did not. He stood at the end of the table and looked at the window and then at her. "The petition will be heard in 12 days, he said. "Vayne has 3 council members supporting it. She argues administrative error. She will present the argument that the wolf's response was a behavioral anomaly, stress, proximity, unfamiliar scent, and not a recognition event. Can she prove that? She cannot. But she does not need to prove it. She needs to create enough procedural doubt that the council delays, and delays long enough that her own petition for the contract presents a cleaner solution. How long can she delay? Indefinitely, if she is clever about it." He looked at her. "She is very clever." "I know," Sable said. "She came to see me." That surprised him. She saw it in the stillness that preceded his response, the fraction of a second where he was not yet managing what he was about to say. What did she say? That I am nobody, that there are procedural remedies, that the Alpha King's intention is not the relevant consideration. Sable paused. She was not wrong about any of it. She was wrong about one thing. Which thing? That I would not know what to do about it. He looked at her for a long time. The wolf behind his eyes had gone very still. The particular stillness she was beginning to associate not with calm, but with focused attention. "What are you going to do about it?" he said. "I do not know yet. I need to understand the records better, the compact." She looked at him steadily. "What do you want? Actually, not procedurally, not officially." He did not answer immediately. He came to the table and sat, which reduced the distance between them to 3 feet of old oak, and looked at his own hands. He had the hands of someone who worked, not with his fists, but with documents and decisions, long hours of it, the specific wear of sustained responsible thought. "I want," he said slowly, as if choosing each word with the care of someone who has learned to be careful with them, "to not be managed. I want someone who reads the index before the books and asks me questions I do not expect." He paused. "I want what happened 6 days ago in that hall to not be an error." She sat with that. The box was warm in her lap. "Then help me understand what I'm working with," she said. "All of it, not the public version." He told her. It took an hour and a half. When it was over, she walked back to the East Wing with a great deal of information and the quiet sense that she had just had the most honest conversation of her 23 years, which was either encouraging or alarming, and she had not yet decided which. What she had decided, without announcing it even to herself, was that she intended to win this. He had changed her library access on the 4th day of the 2nd week. She had not asked for it. She had not known it had changed until she reached for a document in the restricted section, and the librarian, instead of stopping her, simply stepped aside. She checked the access register later. The notation was in the king's hand, unrestricted. She stood at the register for a moment, looking at the handwriting, deliberate, not decorative, the hand of someone who considered what they were writing before they wrote it, and then went to find the document she had wanted. His steward, she learned from the East Wing housekeeper, had noted that the woman in the small room with the iron stove was to be moved to larger quarters. Sable had not yet been moved, but the instruction was on the roster. It was the kind of thing no one announced. It was the kind of thing someone did quietly when they were not yet ready to announce it and were not certain they should, but had done it anyway. She had thought about him standing at the end of the table, asking her what she was going to do, and looking at his own hands. She thought about it at an entirely inconvenient moment, in the middle of reviewing Vayne's petition structure by lamplight, when she should have been thinking only about procedural language and precedent. She told herself her pulse was from the lamp fumes and kept working. He had been walking toward her in the corridor on the morning of the 3rd week, when the crowd from the changing of the guard came through the passage, and his arm came around her before she had registered the movement, solid and certain, pulling her into him until the press of guards had passed. He did not look down at her. She did not look up at him. When the corridor cleared, he released her without comment, and she told herself very firmly that her heartbeat was from the crowd and walked in the opposite direction. She thought about it 2 scenes later, in a completely unrelated moment, when she was trying to concentrate on a precedent document, which she found inconvenient and noted as information without deciding what to do with it. Vayne moved on the 3rd week. It was not dramatic. Dramatic was not Vayne's method. Vayne filed a supplementary petition that quietly reclassified the contract box as Crown property temporarily held in administrative error, which meant Sable was required to surrender it to the steward's office pending the council hearing. It was entirely procedural. It was entirely legal. And it meant that whatever evidence Sable had been quietly building, the records she had found, the archivist's documentation, the careful paper trail of 400 years of precedent, would be inaccessible to her if the box went to the steward's office, because the box contained documents she had folded inside the sealed cavity beneath the contract, documents about the original compact that Warden Cassell had given her and that she had placed there for safekeeping. She did not surrender the box. She said the box was not Crown property in temporary error. It was the material object of a bond compact that predated the current administrative structure by 3 centuries, and surrendering it would constitute a procedural prejudgment before the council's hearing, and she would like that noted in the record. The council member who had come to collect it looked at her for a moment and then noted it in the record. He reported back to Vayne. Vayne filed another supplementary motion. Sable read it the same day it was filed and responded within 48 hours. The response was 12 pages and cited 47 documents, 31 of which were from the restricted section she now had unrestricted access to. Warden Cassell, when she showed him the response, read it from beginning to end and then set it down and said, "You are going to be all right." She thought about Izenthi in the first row, with her composed expression and her 6 years of practice and the green gown, and she thought, "I intend to be." She found him by accident the night before the hearing. She had been in the council antechamber late, working by candlelight on the last of her citations, and she had been walking back through the stone corridor that ran behind the great hall when she saw the light under the council chamber door. She had not intended to look. She looked anyway, through the narrow gap the door had left. He was alone. The council members had gone. The great table was empty, except for one candle and a document he held in both hands. He was reading it, or he had been reading it. When she looked, he was sitting with it in his hands, not turning it, just sitting, with the expression of someone who was very tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He looked like the person inside the Alpha King, which was different from the Alpha King in a way she had not expected, and did not have a word for yet. There was something about the angle of his shoulders that told her he had been holding a great deal upright for a very long time, and that he was good at it, and that it had cost him something over the years to be so good at it. She stood in the corridor for a moment. The wolf behind his eyes, she noticed, even through the gap in the door, was quiet, not watching, not alert. Just there, as if it had stopped performing watchfulness, because there was no one in the room to perform for. She did not go in. She walked back to the east wing. She set the box on the table and looked at it. She thought about his shoulders. She thought about the 12 pages and the 47 citations and the hearing tomorrow. She thought about the word he had said in the library on the third day, in answer to her question about whether the name was an error. No. She allowed herself to acknowledge, quietly and without performance, that she was not indifferent to any of this. Not to the hearing, not to the outcome, not to him. She had been trying to be strategic and competent and careful, and she had been all of those things. And underneath all of them, she was also someone who had looked through a door and seen a person she did not want to lose access to. Someone who had thought about the weight of his arm in a corridor at a completely unrelated moment. Someone who had looked at his handwriting in the library register and noticed that it was careful. She went to sleep with that thought, and it was still there in the morning, quiet and unremarkable, like something that had always been there and had only now been named. The hearing was in the great hall. Sable had expected to be nervous. She was not, which was itself a kind of information. She walked into the hall with the iron box under her arm and took the indicated position at the centre of the floor and looked at the council's 3 rows of benches and the table at the front where the Alpha King sat. He was in formal dress. The wolf was behind his eyes, entirely still, watching. Izenthi sat in the first row. Her expression was as composed as it had always been. She looked at Sable with the particular certainty of someone who has done everything correctly and expects it to matter. Sable found she did not blame her for that. Izenthi had done everything correctly. She had trained for years. She had filed the right documents and engaged the right advisors and built the right coalition. She deserved the outcome she had worked for. She had just not accounted for the wolf. Vayne presented first. She was thorough and precise, and her procedural argument was genuinely excellent. The wolf's response, she argued, was a behavioral anomaly occurring under specific stress conditions. The hall, the density of ranked wolves, proximity to multiple candidates whose combined supernatural signatures had created an unusual environmental pressure. The steward had responded to the anomaly by writing the nearest name on the document. This was understandable. It was also not a recognition event. A recognition event had specific requirements under the compact, and those requirements had not been met, and she could demonstrate this with reference to 3 separate legal precedents from the previous century. It was a very good argument. The 3 supporting council members nodded at several points. When she sat, her expression was quietly certain. Sable stood. She opened the box. The lock released under her hands, not because she forced it, but because it simply did, as if it had been waiting for this particular morning in this particular room. The council went very quiet. She removed the contract, the steward's document with her name on it, and set it on the table in front of the Alpha King. Then she removed the other documents. Cassell's records, the original compact, the archivist Lithol's account from 400 years ago, the registration of the dormancy, the procedural requirements of the recognition event under the old compact, which listed, among other things, the behavior of the lock. She laid them out one at a time and said nothing while she did it. Then she said, "The bond compact predates the administrative structure that governs the petition before this council. The compact holds that the wolf's recognition is not a behavioral event categorizable as error. It is a bloodline event categorizable as fact. The petition requests that the council treat a fact as an error. The council does not have the procedural authority to do that, not because I am arguing against the petition, but because the compact is not within the council's jurisdiction to adjudicate. She cited the records, all 47 of them. She was clear, and she was organized, and she did not hurry. When she finished, she set the last document down and said, "The box opened under my hands. That is also in the archivist's record, page 11 of Lithel's account. The lock opens for one person. It has opened for one person in every generation where the recognition event occurred. I did not pick the lock." The chamber was quiet for a long time. One of Vayne's supporting members said, carefully, "The lock mechanism is described in the original compact," Sable said. "Page 4. It responds to the recognition bond, not to any key." She paused. "I can read you the relevant passage." She read it. The vote took 11 minutes. The petition was dismissed. Vayne sat in the first row with her hands folded in her lap and said nothing. She was very good. She would find another approach. She always would. Sable did not underestimate that. But today the box was on the table and the documents were spread and the council had voted, and she was still standing. The Alpha King stood from the table. He walked the length of the hall at a pace that was not ceremonial and was not hurried. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her the way he had looked at her on the third day in the library, with that quality of complete and undivided attention, the wolf behind his eyes entirely still, not performing calm, but actually calm in the way of something that has arrived at exactly the place it intended to be. "Stay," he said, "not because the wolf chose you, because I am choosing you." The hall was quiet enough to hear the candles. "Ask me properly," she said. A muscle moved at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile. It was something more specific than a smile, the expression of a man who has just been answered in a way he did not expect, and has found it was exactly the right answer. He asked her properly. She said yes. Vayne did not disappear. People like Vayne did not disappear. They regrouped and filed from different angles and found institutional footholds in the way that skilled and determined people always did. She filed 3 more supplementary motions over the following months, each one technically sound, each one targeting a different procedural element. Sable read all of them within 48 hours of their filing and responded to all of them within a week. It was a significant amount of administrative work, and she did it without drama, because drama was not her method either. Izenthi had left the court within a fortnight of the hearing, which was probably wise. Sable had not seen her again. She thought about her occasionally. The green gown, the 6 years of practice, the certainty, and thought that in another story, Izenthi might have been the protagonist, might have been the one who deserved the ending. She was not sure what to do with that, except to be honest about it, and not pretend the outcome was simple. The court was not unanimous in its adjustment. There were council members who had a category for a high house daughter and no category for a woman from the East Wing with a wool dress and a comprehensive knowledge of procedural records and a direct manner of speech. They were not hostile, most of them. They were simply uncertain in the particular way of people who have not yet updated their understanding of a situation. Sable was patient about this. She had spent 23 years being patient about being undercategorizable. She had developed some skill in it. She was still herself. She went to the library in the mornings and read the index before the books. She still found the quieter cook preferable at bread hour. She still sat cross-legged on the floor when the material warranted it, and the floor was clean enough. These things had not changed. The room had changed. She had been moved to the larger quarters, which had 2 windows and a better stove and a long shelf she had organized by subject. And the access had changed, and the position had changed, but the particular quality of her attention, and the way she thought, and the way she held herself, had not. She had not become someone else. She had simply stopped being invisible. Rooms knew she was there now. When she walked into the council antechamber in the morning, The council members who were already present acknowledged it. This still struck her as faintly remarkable, and she noted it each time without comment. The wolf slept at her feet in the council antechamber while she worked. This had begun on its own, without ceremony, in the 3rd week after the hearing. She had looked down one morning, and the wolf was there, very large and very warm against her ankles, breathing slowly. She had looked at it for a moment, and then kept working. Corvath had appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later, and looked at the wolf, and then at her, with an expression she now had a word for, and which she had decided, after some deliberation, to simply let herself recognize, rather than explain away. He told her things, not in the mode of conversation that she had grown up understanding as intimacy, not long evenings of careful self-disclosure. He told her things matter-of-factly, as reports, the complicated political history of the eldest council member, which was significantly more interesting than the official record suggested, and which she found she was genuinely interested in, his opinions on the state of the northern roads, which were bad, and had been bad for longer than anyone had officially acknowledged, and this bothered him specifically, because it was a solvable problem that had not been solved due to a bureaucratic misclassification that he found genuinely absurd. The way the pack hierarchy worked in practice versus on paper, which were different in several places that mattered. Small things, specific things, things he had apparently been accumulating for a long time with no one to give them to. She told him things in return. The system she had developed for tracking Vayne's filing patterns. She had identified 3, and could predict the 4th. The cook who talked to himself, and why she preferred him. The specific quality of the morning light through the east window at bread hour that made it worth arriving early. He listened to all of it with the full attention he brought to everything, and she found, after some time, that she had been doing what she always did with things she valued, memorizing the index, learning the structure of him before the contents, finding the organization system. "Ask me something," he said one morning. He was sitting across the table from her, which had become its own ordinary thing, him coming into the antechamber rather than standing in doorways, sitting across the table while she worked. The wolf's tail moved against the floor. The iron box sat open on the shelf above the long table, the documents inside settled, unremarkable. She had stopped carrying it with her 3 weeks after the hearing. It lived on the shelf now. She knew where it was. She looked up at him. His expression was open in the way it was when they were alone, without the management he wore for the court. She thought about the night before the hearing and the door and his shoulders. "How long have you been holding everything upright?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside the window, the northern light was the grey gold of late morning, finding the edge of his jaw, finding the dust on the old shelf above the box. "Since I was 17, he said. "That is a long time," she said. "Yes." She set down her quill. She moved her hand across the table and covered his. She felt the warmth of it under her palm, specific, solid, the warmth of someone who was present rather than performing presence. He turned his hand and held hers, and did not say anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. They sat like that for a while. The wolf breathed slowly at her feet. Through the window, a grey pigeon landed on the sill and regarded them without interest and flew away. He pressed his forehead against hers. She felt him exhale, long and deliberate, like something set down after a very long carrying distance. She put her other hand against his chest and felt his heart beat slow and steady under her palm, and did not speak. There was nothing to say, and saying anything would have been the wrong thing. She kept her hand where it was, and he kept his forehead against hers, and they stayed like that in the cold morning light until the wolf shifted at her feet, and the quality of the silence changed into the kind that meant the morning was moving on. Later, when she had picked up her quill again, and he had moved to the window with a document of his own, she said, "I know why Lithal carried the wolf's name in her sleeve." He did not look up from the document. Why? Because it was hers, she said. The name was hers. Nothing else she had was that particular kind of hers. He was quiet for a moment. She heard the sound of him setting the document down. What will you do with it? She looked at the box on the shelf. Open, settled, ordinary. Put it in the index, she said, where I can find it. He made a sound that was almost, not quite, but almost, a laugh. The wolf's tail moved against the stone floor, slow and unhurried. She was writing when he crossed the room. She did not hear him coming, because she had learned by now that she did not always hear him coming, that sometimes she only knew he was there because the quality of the air changed and the wolf's tail moved differently. He stood beside her chair for a moment. She kept writing. He kissed her forehead, the way someone keeps a promise, careful, deliberate, as if he had been thinking about how to do it without frightening either of them, and had decided that slowly was the answer. She set her quill down and turned her face up to his, and he kissed her once, properly, like a man who had been patient for a long time, and had decided that the time for patience had passed. Then he stepped back and picked up his document and went back to the window. She sat for a moment and then picked up her quill and turned the page. The wolf did not move from her feet. It never did any more. It was simply there each morning when she arrived, the way the box was simply there on the shelf, and the light was simply there through the window, and the index was simply the thing she read before the books. The impossible thing had been patiently made ordinary. Every morning it was there, unremarkable and entire, and the court had learned to walk around it the way you walk around furniture that belongs in a room. She had not become someone else. She walked into rooms, and the rooms knew she was there, and that was a different kind of invisible, the kind where they noticed the absence of you rather than your presence. She found this preferable. She was still Sable, still cross-legged on the floor when the material warranted it, still the quieter cook at bread hour, still the index first and the book second, and all of that was entirely unremarkable now because it was simply what the person in that room was like, and the person in that room was hers to be. She was still carrying the box, in a sense. It was on the shelf, and it was open, and the documents inside were accessible to anyone who needed them. The lock would not open for anyone else. She had thought about this occasionally and found that she did not mind. It was the most specific thing she had ever been told about herself, and it had been told to her by something that had no category for performance or strategy or a good gown and a composed expression. The wolf had looked at her through a hall full of better options and decided. She had the index. She knew where to find things. She knew where to find him. That was, she thought, on a grey morning in the antechamber, with the wolf asleep at her feet, and the box open on the shelf, and the sound of his quill moving on the other side of the room. Enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.